This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a new project, Education Week teamed up with ProPublica to document what hate looks like in the nation's public schools. How frequent are the incidents? What are some of the common denominators? And how much have things really changed since President Donald Trump took office? Representing Education Week with us today is Francisco Vara-Orta. Francisco, thank you for being here.
Hello, it's great to be back with you.
What drew you to this project?
Actually, it all started with a message I saw scrawled on a board during NICAR, which is, it's a data journalism gathering back in 2017. We were in Jacksonville, Florida, and Rachel Glickhouse from ProPublica was attending and had written on a message board about the project and sought any collaborators. And so I thought, at the time I was a contributing writer at Education Week on fellowship, finishing up my master's, and I took down the information and reached out to Rachel. I thought I could work on the project however they needed. I did mention it to my editors and they were extremely receptive. And once I joined the staff in a full-time capacity, we got the ball rolling on really digging into it.
So what were the parameters here? How was Education Week and ProPublica defining things like hate speech for the purpose of this project? What were you looking for?
The definition was the one that you kind of see in the dictionaries and, where we focus on speech that attacks a person based on their race, religion, ethnic origin, national origin, sex, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity. We're looking in general at hate crimes, which can range from being physically assaulted all the way to having someone yell a term that's offensive at you, to hate graffiti. So swastikas, seeing things that are spray painted on walls or scrawled in bathrooms, as we saw in a lot of schools, that are viewed as offensive or hate speech. And then bias incidents, which are a little bit more about acts of hostility. They can be different from a hate crime in that it doesn't necessarily involve criminal activity. And so that's kind of the universe. And so really we're just looking for incidents that involve the nature of those types of incidents.
And you were looking at a very specific time period. You were looking from 2015 up through 2017. And one of the things we want to point out is it's a little difficult to not just quantify these events, but also to make comparisons, to make generalizations about whether there's been more or less. Explain to us why some of that data is so difficult to wrestle with.
The gist of it is that federal law requires the U.S. Department of Justice to report hate crime statistics, but local and state police departments aren't required to do so, and so many don't. And then the hate crime laws themselves differ, particularly around sexual orientation. 5 states don't even have hate crime statutes. So that results in a lot of inconsistencies on the data. It's really up to the jurisdictions at the police department level or the school district level to make sure this data gets reported to a higher level agency. And then some of the information's collected, but it's not uniform. So you can't really get an accurate picture of the types of incidents that occur and necessarily which groups are being targeted. And I think that's why we haven't always seen as deep coverage on this, because it is happening.
You did see some interesting trends that I want to dig into. And then you also found that these incidents were a little bit higher or more likely to be found in some of the suburban campuses.
Yeah, and I think it's important to frame it in that, we had over 5,000 tips and we got about 600 reports of incidents around these. And then we had to kind of build out an analysis from there. And so most of the data had been reported in the current year when this launched, which was 2017. A lot of folks remembered incidents from 2015 and 2016. They started collecting them once the campaign started to take a turn towards identity politics in the rhetoric in late 2015. For any people that are Latino, right off the bat when Donald Trump said the comments about Mexicans and being rapists, that a lot of Latino groups were tracking this. So we knew that there would be better data around that time frame, which is why we focused on that. And we worked to verify them through talking to people that had reported them or police reports or other organizations. There was 140 news organizations that helped out with this. So they kind of verified in their own community. So off that is where we could start building, trying to figure out a better sense of any trends. I do want to preface it in that you can't really say definitively 100% where all of the discrimination is happening with these incidents, that is one group more targeted than the other. But it's enough of a sense to know that it, A, is definitely happening, and B, there are reports that center around certain populations that keep coming up. And so we knew we had to acknowledge those things and just make sure people knew the context, that we're not saying that this is the end-all be-all data set.
So you got thousands of tips. Let's talk about how you filtered through those to get the data and what you found.
So we whittled down to a solid set of 472 verified accounts through the media reports and through the verification process. And in the school sector, a lot of them had to do more with speech and with graffiti than they did with physical violence. There was so much in the data set, we had to figure out what to focus on, and we tried to focus on what was most common that we saw amongst these reports. And we looked at race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and the four populations that came up the most that were targeted were Black students, followed by Jewish students, then Latino students, and Muslim students. We worked with the Visuals campaign to break down those four sectors in the project, talking about the N-word, build the wall, swastikas, and go back to, which is typically go back to Mexico, but we did see it and go back to wherever you came from or your country directed at Muslims. And as time went on during the presidential race, we saw a lot more anti-Latino, anti-Semitic, and anti-Muslim sentiment, particularly out of Donald Trump's campaign. And so these catchphrases that were used during the campaign, that caught on, such as build the wall, really seemed to be popular in these incidents amongst folks that wanted to tease or bully or harass Latino students. Build the wall didn't start with Donald Trump, but a lot of people associated with him and with an anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant sentiment. And so it's important to remind people that the wall was being built during the Bush years, and it has been popular in more white nationalist circles, and it really did catch on as a phrase. We saw tons of reports about swastikas showing up. And so people, to have some kind of understanding. With swastikas, it was very important to us to not only make sure to hammer away at the truth around what a swastika represents to the Jewish community, but how to a lot of white supremacists and folks that are ignorant that it's a catch-all symbol for discrimination. So it sends a chilling message to, if essentially you're a minority of any type that's been historically oppressed, I'm probably not going to like you or be a fan of you or want you around.
We often encourage our journalist members to remember correlation as not causation. And certainly there's been efforts to frame this as, this is all about President Trump. But what's interesting is that, this Ed Week ProPublica package came out around the same time that we got some new data from the Centers for Disease Control, which does a youth survey every couple of years asking kids about bullying. And they said that there hadn't been any kind of a spike in bullying. Do you see that as apples to oranges, or what kind of framing do you use for that?
I think it's important to just say that two things can be happening at once, and that the data is still so new that sometimes it's hard to know when the trends are going to show up in it. I mean, if anyone studied economic data, recessions don't always show up immediately, right? So the on-the-ground reporting shows that a lot of communities felt that and heard Trump's name used, interwoven with these incidents. So people would yell, Trump says all of you need to go back to where you came from. And so there is an undeniable connection there. But it's very important to remember that these incidents were happening before the campaign in 2016. And so we talked to an expert, Deborah Temkin, who worked with the Obama administration and advised us to remember that there's not just one cause of bullying. So you can't scapegoat it on the president, because whether you like him or not, it kind of just, brushes aside the other responsibility in the system. And the education system can't do anything at this point about the election of Donald Trump, but what they can do is respond to the incidents. And so creating a culture around a good response is important, and that this may get lost in the political dialogue of whose fault is it, was a major concern of some of the experts we spoke with, and families that said, I was called the N-word before Donald Trump became a candidate for the presidency. And so I think you can't fully uncouple them, because you do have incidents where Trump's name, as Reveal and as BuzzFeed reported last year using some of this data, But we wanted to broaden it out and really show folks that this was happening before that. And so that's something that's systemic and can be addressed with some of these efforts that I write about later in the story.
We're talking with Francisco Vara-Orta about his reporting on incidents of hate in the nation's public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Francisco, you talked with a teacher, Jennifer Gross, in Virginia, who teaches a course on the Holocaust and genocides, and she's done that for 15 years. And what she said to you really struck me when she said she used to have to hunt around to find examples of anti-Semitic graffiti, and they were typically, a decade old. Now she can go to most major news outlets and find anything she needs just from a few weeks ago.
When Jennifer Goss described to me how her course has changed and the interest in it, I did think that was interesting because some folks are still waking up to this, I think, in a way. And for her, she really has been watching this for a while. And so what did surprise me is that she did report a change from her perspective, because she knows that this isn't totally new, but she herself was taken aback by how prevalent they became. And so while there was data reported in some Jewish communities where there was definitely an uptick, such as Massachusetts, which we talk about in that chapter of the story, I think Jennifer's voice is really illuminating for teachers to think about trying to confront the reality that this may be more prevalent than they know, and that it's not something just in the history books. And a lot of folks, I think, really had hoped that it had been.
One of the things that comes through very clearly in your story is that this is a challenge for students in part because it's happening at a place that they can't leave, at least not easily. They have to be in school. They have to be in class with this peer group. And if this kind of behavior is happening to them, it's very difficult to get away from it.
It is. It's a safety issue, really. And what was important to bring in, especially for our audience, is that they, I think, are somewhat aware of this, but I do find teachers wanting to know, okay, well, what can I do? And across the board, experts told us you have to first make the students that are reporting these incidents and their families feel safe. And then you can start talking about, okay, well, what was the nature of this incident? Can we determine any type of intent? What's the context? What can we do as far as anti-bias training with our staff, or bringing in speakers to talk about this with our students? And those signs help make the families feel safer, that it's being taken seriously, and that this affects the students who are not targeted because they're being exposed to this, they're picking up on it, and the students really feel like it's on the adults to help set the tone and set the pace of how things are responded to in a timely, sensitive manner. And what some of the students told me too is that, again, this is where they feel like the president's voice is so important on this issue, is because whatever he does or says, or whatever the president at any time he or she says or does, can set the tone for their classmates to look up to those folks, or people in their families. And so those students come to the school with those attitudes and whatever they see with the president doing. And so these students feel like they don't want to make this political, that they just want to be left alone so they can study and they can feel safe. And I mean, the students a lot of times feel demoralized by the end of this process after what they go through. And I think one important point that I'll finish with here was, it was interesting to me when I spoke with an expert out of UT Austin who has done some research on this. And she said, we have initial evidence that if you're being discriminated against by your peers, that there's more likely to affect your social and emotional well-being. So you'll withdraw maybe in that sense. But then if it's a teacher or a school staff member, an adult who everyone kind of looks up to or looks to for guidance and behavior, it's more likely to influence their academics. So I thought that was really interesting to kind of distinguish how the discrimination or these incidents or this hate speech coming from who can impact the students. And that does have a trickle-down effect to like test scores and graduation rates. And it's all more interconnected than I think we want to realize.
So what are some of the solutions that are being proposed to counter these hate incidents? And do education reporters have any special responsibilities here in framing that part of the coverage?
I think when you're reporting on trauma and on hate and the incidents that we're seeing with the Documenting Hate Project, where we try to be cognizant of, okay, this has happened, and now what? And so several experts said hiring teachers of color, yes, is important, and for white students as well. What I really appreciated about my interview with some of the folks working on diversity and inclusion in Denver, where it's very diverse students, but the teaching workforce is 70% white roughly, there were discussions around what is white privilege, what is whiteness, and what are all of our histories, and how do we end up here? And I think that that's something that where the school system can come in. There's an inherent curiosity about most people's heritage, no matter what your background is. And I think that that's a silver lining that could come out of this project, I hope, for educators reading it. And there's just a general fatigue of these incidents. I think even if you're horrified by them, or you come from some of these backgrounds, you're tired of seeing these videos of people being discriminated against. So for me, if you want to have effective journalism, I think moving forward in 2018 onward, it's important to think about not discounting the importance of incorporating solutions and talking to communities that feel like they want to address it head on and are trying to do something about it. Because there's no silver bullet with this. And it will be an ongoing challenge as the nation's demographics change. But it's important to remember that shouldn't discourage us as reporters and journalists and policymakers and educators from trying to embrace that challenge.
Francisco, you've been pretty candid about some of your own experiences growing up in Texas, where you were targeted for different reasons. And I want to talk for a moment about what you learned at a recent panel by Investigative Reporters and Editors, IRE.
Yes, I attended the recent IRE conference in Orlando, Florida, and there was a panel about how to cover trauma and mass shootings. And I, in general, thought as reporters, we don't want to be the story. We are in an unprecedented time, which I know that word's overused, but it's the truth, where journalists are actually getting shot in newsrooms. And so that creates an effect of, okay, how much do we keep minimizing the discrimination we've experienced and minimizing the trauma we've experienced, whether it be in childhood, out on the scene reporting, and what we have to read and consume and do interviews about, to sometimes, sadly, even in our own newsrooms. And so that panel created a space that I think is opening up in journalism that's going to help us be better at telling these stories, because I think we have to understand our own. It's hard not to feel the effects of some of these stories, and it's a different time in journalism, and we really have to treat understanding that trauma and how to report on it and how to self-care to some degree as important skill sets, at least moving forward in the short term, given the stories we've seen the last few years and probably will continue to see for at least a few more years as our nation figures out kind of where it wants to go on these stories and with these policies.
What's a story idea for a local reporter who may be looking at this project with Education Week and ProPublica as a launching pad?
Well, it's a treasure trove of stories, and particularly for local, regional, and state reporters. And I say that in that it was tricky for us at a national level to put together a comprehensive analysis that we thought would be fair and balanced and thoughtful. And so when I was doing the analysis, nearly every state had some report in the K through 12 space, and certainly at the project's grander level, it's incidents in all public spaces. So I would encourage any news organization to approach ProPublica and ask to be part of the consortium and get access to that data, and you can do a great local story, because a lot of this is narrative driven, but this gives us some data to work with, and it gives us some sources that are willing to share their traumatic experiences. And anyone that's trying to do effective narrative journalism knows that it's important to get that access to those folks. And a lot of times these folks that have experienced it, they have great documentation behind these incidents. And so it makes the job a little bit easier, because we are in a place where there is a lot of information, and there are sadly been times where people have put out fake information, false reports about an experience, and that kind of sets back the whole movement around reporting on these things, because it is happening, and it allows for more folks to deny it. And it's evident if you look in all these communities that it is happening. So the project will be going on, I know, until the end of the year. ProPublica has committed to it for this 2-year window. And I hope that whatever moves on from here, that news organizations keep digging into this, because it's not going to go away.
Francisco Vara-Orta is an education journalist and will soon join the national staff of Chalkbeat. He's also vice president of the Education Writers Association. Francisco, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.